Likutei Sichos, Chelik Chavtes, volume 29, the Sicha for Chai Elul. This Sicha will explain the unique dual impact of this very special day of Chai Elul. As a quick introduction, first of all, we all know that the Hebrew alphabet has numerical value. Thus, Chai, which translates into the word life, like as in life energy, Chai has the numerical value of 18. Thus, the 18th day of Elul is referred to as Chai Elul. Now, what is the 18th day of Elul? Well, the 18th day of Elul is the birthday both of the Baal Shem Tov, Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, and of the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the founder of the Chabad Hasidic movement. The Baal Shem Tov was born in the year 5458, which is 1698, and the Alter Rebbe was born in the year 5505 Kahas, which corresponds to the year 1745. As a quick introduction, the Rebbe, his approach, the Rebbe's philosophy was that all the words, the teachings, the sayings of all our sages, going back all the generations, are very, very accurate, very precise, and very specific. That this is when it comes to Mishnah, to Medrash, to Gemara, and moreover, when it comes to the words, the sayings, the anecdotes that were shared by our Rabbeim, the Rebbes of Chabad, the leaders of the Chabad throughout the generations, they are very, very specific and very, very resourceful in all the nuances and all the indications that are there. One needs to kind of take a closer look to really appreciate all the deep lessons that come out when we notice all these interesting nuances and detail. Another thing to be familiar with, the idea, the concept of Isarusa de Le'ela versus Isarusa de Latata. Isarusa means like an arousal, an awakening. There is Isarusa de Le'ela, which means an arousal that comes from above. When Hashem, so to speak, makes the situation, Hashem shines down the particular spiritual energies. And then there's the Isarusa de Latata. The Latata means from below, which comes from the person. That we do our avodah, we do our investment of effort, of dedication, and that triggers, so to speak, the arousal from above. This corresponds to the acronym of the word Elul, the name of this month, Ani lidoidi li, which translates literally as I am to my beloved is to me. I basically meaning us, the Yid. We say I am to my beloved. I first have this arusa de latata. We have, in other words, the main focus of this month, as we'll see in the Sicha, is our effort that we put in here, the arousal, the trigger, the initiation that comes from below, from our avodah. And then there is vidoidi li, the arusa de le'ela. Let's go into the Sicha. So regarding this very special day of Chai Elul, as we said, the birthday of the Baal Shem Tov and the Alter Rebbe, the previous Rebbe shared in the Sicha, which is printed in Likutei Deburim, and he said the following: by Hasidim, there is an ancient proverb, an ancient saying, in two expressions, or two versions. The first one says, the first version is, Chai Elul is the day which brought and brings a chayas to Elul. Exactly that, I translated it verbatim. It's the day which brought and brings a chayas to Elul. That's the first version. The other version, the other expression is Chai Elul gives or contributes a chayas means a life energy, into the avodah, into the service of Ani Lidoidi Vidoidi Li. Now the fact that, says the Rebbe, the fact that the previous Rebbe chose to repeat both versions tells us that both of them are correct. And that in each one, there is an extra lesson, or perhaps you can say an expressive novelty versus the other one. And therefore both are necessary. Moreover, the fact that the Rebbe chose not only to say it, but to say it in this order, and to indicate that this is the first and this is the second version, tells that itself is also very, very telling. That tells us that first comes the aspect of the day which brought and brings the Chayas and Elul, and only following that comes the second aspect, which we'll understand by learning the Sicha, which says that Chai Elul is the idea that it gives a chayis into ani l'doidi v'doidi li. Now let's take a closer look for a moment to begin to appreciate this at the variations between the first expression and the second expression. In the first expression, number one, it says Chai Elul is the day that brings. In the second version, it doesn't say Chai Elul, it just says Chai Elul gives. So here there's an indication that it's the day of Chai Elul, and here it just says Chai Elul. That's number one. Make a note of that. Number two, in the first version it says the day has brought and brings, past tense and present, a chayis into Elul. Whereas the second version just says it gives a chayis into Elul. It contributes a chayis into Elul, something very present. A third variance between the two, where the first one says that it brought and it brings a chayis into Elul, whereas the second version says it brings a chayis into the avodah of ani l'doidi v'doidi li. To take note of these three major differences between the first version and the second one. Now, it's obvious, says the Rebbe, that these differences are not just some kind of light difference in language and expression, but rather that they are a difference in content, in context. They have a meaning, a contextual meaning, which is basically that the first version is focusing on the day of Chai Elul. This emphasizes the aspect of time, that this is a special time, this is a unique time in the context of, in the general context of Elul, versus the second version, which is referring to not so much the time aspect, the calendar aspect of Chai Elul, but rather to the actual idea, to the actual essence, to the actual aspect of Chai Elul itself. Example for this, just so we get an understanding what the difference between these two ways of looking at it. Think about Shabbos. From the one hand, Shabbos is part of the week, because it is the seventh day of the week. It's part of the week, it's the seventh day of the week, but because it's the seventh, and typically the seventh is the holiest, seventh day, kol hashvin chavivin, therefore Shabbos is an elevated and more special time, a holier time within the realm of these 7 days. But then there's another way to look at Shabbos, or a greater aspect of Shabbos, where it is that Shabbos in itself is holy. Shabbos is a unique holiness. It's just that it happens to shine. It happens to present itself on the seventh day of the week. So the emphasis is more of the time, that, the first way of looking at it, that it's the seventh day. So the seventh within the time is a most elevated level, and therefore it's holy. Or you say, no, it has nothing to do with it. The Shabbos itself is holy. It just happens to be in the seventh day. And this is the difference between these two versions. According to the first version, the emphasis is on the time, that the time of Chai Elul injects into the time of Elul, meaning the whole span of the time of Elul, it's a special point, so it injects an extra chayas. But according to the second version, the injection of chayas doesn't come because of Chai Elul being a part of the aspect of time, but rather Chai Elul in itself represents a very heightened level of holiness, a very special and unique day of spiritual energy in itself, separate from the fact that it happens to be within a certain time frame. Now, this difference stands out even more when you look at the words, because in the first version, what is the impact that he says the Chayis has on Elul? The impact is on Elul. Elul is an entire month. That is something which is a matter of time. A month is a matter of time. It happens to be called Elul. Versus the second version says that the Chayus, the heightened level of spiritual energy, has an impact on the avodah of ani l'doidi v'doidi li, which isn't specifically restricted to the time, so to speak. It's not the aspect of the time, but rather it's the aspect in itself, the aspect of avodah. Also, when you look at the words, the difference in how he says the spiritual energy, the chayas, is being contributed, is being imported. In the first version, he says, it brings, right? It brought and it brings a chayas into Elul. Well, brought and brings, that in itself inherently indicates that it's coming from elsewhere, that it's coming from somewhere else. This is just an agent that is transporting it, bringing from elsewhere. Versus the second version, it says, Chai Elul gives, meaning something that's present that gives from itself, as if so to speak, meaning that it's not taking it from elsewhere, but rather it's coming from within. What is the explanation in all of this, to better understand this? In regards to the month of Elul, we actually find two aspects. In the one hand, as we mentioned in the introduction, it's clear and obvious that the idea of Elul is first and foremost Isarusa dilatata, which is the avodah sadam, the avodah, the contribution that we have to give. And we see it in the words ani l'doidi, and it starts off with that. It initiates with that. That tells us this is the most important aspect of it, that the person has to create, so to speak, and make the moment. Then there is v'doidi li, which is, yes, isarusa de la'ela. But really, if you think about it, because the doidi li comes from ani l'doidi, that in itself emphasizes and proves that the main aspect of Elul, and perhaps the exclusive aspect of Elul, is Isarusa dilatata. Because you're saying that without the Isarusa dilatata, you cannot get to the Isarusa dilatata. Without the Ani L'Doidi, you can't get to the Doidi Li. So obviously, the main aspect, in short, of Elul is Ani L'Doidi, the Isarusa dilatata. Moreover, the Alter Rebbe also stresses in the Maimer that ultimately the V'doidi Li does not really come in the month of Elul, it comes after the month of Elul. So this proves the point, this strengthens this point that the Rebbe is making, that the main aspect of Elul is Isarusa dilatata. But this is on one hand. On the other hand, however, as the Alter Rebbe explains, and he gives even a metaphor, he gives a parable for it, he gives a mashal for it, the Alter Rebbe explains how in this month, the month of Elul, there's a iskalus, there's an absolute full revelation of the 13 attributes of mercy, which means that Hashem is showering down spiritual energy. That is Isarusa de La'ela. So you see, you have both aspects in Elul. You have the aspect where the main emphasis is Isarusa de Latata, and then you have the other hand where there is a Isarusa de La'ela. However, says the Rebbe, still we go back to the point and say that the main aspect of Elul is Isarusa de Latata. Why? Even though you have Isarusa de La'ela, right? We just said that Hashem reveals, Hashem shines, so to speak, that the full force of the energy, the power of the 13 attributes of mercy. So the Rebbe explains that ultimately, in order for us to have Isarusa dilatata, in order for it to have any effect, in order for there to be the energy that we can, in order for us to be able to generate the energy with our avodah, ultimately, yes, you need to have Isarusa dilatata. But what's really the main point over here, which really that stands out in Elul, is not so much the Sarusa de Le'ela, but it's the Sarusa de Latata. And this is obviously hinted in the words Ani L'Doidi V'Doidi Li, that the beginning is Ani L'Doidi, as we said before. Now, let's look at it now this way. The Sarusa de Le'ela aspect of Elul, the idea that Elul is a special time when Hashem reveals, shines this powerful energy of the 13 attributes of mercy, this is something which is connected to the time aspect of Elul. Think of it. There are certain times of the year, and one of them happens to be Elul, when Hashem reveals a heightened level of spiritual energy, of spiritual powers. You have in the Yomim Tovim, and here you have Elul. And it happens to be that it coincides with this time, and that's the month of Elul. For whatever reason, so to speak, Hashem decided this is the time when He's revealing it. So this is the time aspect of Elul, right? In other words, it happens to coincide with this great revelation, the month of Elul. However, this is not the actual true aspect of Elul itself. Elul itself, as we said, Ani L'Doidi, This represents the idea of Isarusa Dilatata, the energy, the effort that we put in, the avodah that we put in. According to this, we'll now appreciate, according to what we just explained, we'll appreciate the differences, the variations, that is, between the two versions of this amazing saying that the Frierdiker Rebbe quoted. Just like there are two aspects in the month of Elul itself, likewise, in the day of Chai Elul, you can also suggest, says the Rebbe, that you have these two aspects. In other words, the two aspects of Chai Elul corresponds to the two varying aspects of the month of Elul, as we explained. Let's go at it. The aspect of the day of Chai Elul. Remember, he said in the first version, the day of Chai Elul. This tells us that it's corresponding to the time aspect of it, which means that this is the aspect of the energy of Elul, which comes from above. Remember, we said it has to do with the time. It happens to be the time of the year, and that's why it's there. The second version that says that it gives a chayas in Elul in the avodah of Ani L'Doidi V'Doidi Li, which is the Sarusa Dilatata. This is the representative of the actual aspect, of the essence, of the true essence of what Elul is all about. Not because it just happens to coincide with the time, but the avodah of the person. And this is expressed in the varying nuances of the sayings. Let's look at it closely. In the first saying, remember, he says, the day of Elul. Well, that is a connection to the time. In the second version, it doesn't say the day of Elul. It says the day of Chai Elul. It says Chai Elul, which means the aspect of Chai Elul itself, irrespective of what the time and the calendar that it is. Just the avodah of Chai Elul. That's one difference. Another, and now we understand that, we appreciate it. This represent the time one represents the Sarusa de Leila, and the Chai Elul aspect, the Avodah aspect, represents the Sarusa de Latata. Then you have the second one, which says it brought and it brings a Chayas into Elul, if you recall that. This is an indication that it's being imported from elsewhere, meaning it's coming from above. It's just that Chai Elul helps to channel it, so to speak, in a heightened and more sensitive manner. But it's coming from elsewhere. This is versus the second version that says it gives. It's coming from itself. It's coming from within. Chai Elul itself gives. It's present. Another difference where in the first version, there's an indication, something about the past, right? Brought and brings. Why? What does that show us? Brought means it precedes what's now here. It precedes our avodah. Thus, Isarusa de La'ela, coming from above. That precedes any avodah, any effort from our part. Versus the second one, which speaks about the present, meaning the focus is on our avodah. What are we doing to trigger this, to bring about, after our Isarusa de Latata, to bring about the Isarusa de La'ela? What is the lesson from all of this? Says the Rebbe, number one, to somebody who's just starting in their baby steps of avodah, they can think to themselves, what connection do I have to this special day of Chai Elul? And here comes the answer where we say no. This already, the first version, that's why it's the first one. It's already here. It's already preceded us. It's already been given to us. And therefore, we all have the ability to tap into it because it's present, it's there. It was brought, it brought and brings. It's already here. It's already in existence. And therefore, one should not think, oh, I can't access this because I'm only starting off in my avodah. Now, on the other hand, to somebody who's already really high up there in a very high level of avodah, the lesson over here is that it can't suffice the fact that Chai Elul comes from itself, what Hashem gives, what was brought and was brought. You can't rely on what we already have achieved, but rather you have to continue. That's the second version. You have to continue and do your own avodah and bring in more chayas through Ani L'Doidi V'Doidi Li, which is the Sarusa L'Tata. Continue to add on and get more and more. Now, says the Rebbe, true, we just explained how this addresses one type of person in their beginning of their service of Hashem, and another type which is already way advanced. However, because the Frierdiker Rebbe shared this teaching and insisted on sharing both of them with everyone, and he, in other words, in a public platform, that means that really both apply to everyone. This really applies to everyone equally, meaning to the one who is in the beginning of his, baby steps of his service, and perhaps he's relying on what he's getting from above, but yet he has to know that although right now what's boosting you, what's helping you in your avodah, in your first early baby steps, it's the energy that comes from before, right? Is the sarusa de la'ela, what was brought and what Chai Elul brought. But yet you have to know that you have to strive. You have to know that there is the aspect of Chai Elul that you have to do on your own. You have to function and produce from within yourself, from yourself. And therefore, that's something that he has to strive for, something he has to look towards as a goal. On the other hand, the person is at a very high level that thinks, wow, look at me, and I'm being encouraged now to do more. I have my Sarusa de Latata, needs to remember not to get carried away with oneself, so to speak, not to become arrogant, and remember that ultimately, where does it all come from? The first version. Isarusa de La'ela, it all really starts, is all triggered and begins with what comes from above. And this is reminiscent of the story where the Gemara tells us that Moshe Rabbeinu was shown all the generations, and when he saw Rabbi Akiva teaching his thousands of students, and he tried to pay attention, he tried to listen in, he couldn't understand what he was saying. He was gibberish to him. And Moshe felt a little lightheaded. He felt a little bad. He didn't understand. Here he's teaching Torah and he couldn't understand it. Until finally one of the students asked Rabbi Akiva, what's the source for this? And he said, this is a teaching, halacha l'Moshe Sinai. This was taught to Moshe Rabbeinu. That's where I get it from. Which means that even the chidushim, even though the reason why Moshe Rabbeinu didn't understand it, couldn't really fully comprehend it, is because it was the chidush of Rabbi Akiva, which is only going to come later. But even that, even though it's Rabbi Akiva's work and Rabbi Akiva's accomplishment, but even that comes from Moshe Rabbeinu. Same thing over here. Even though you have Yisarusa de Latata, and you're so great and you're so advanced in your service, and you're being encouraged to do more avodah, but you have to remember that ultimately it's all a result, and all comes because of the Sarusa de Leila that initiated all of this.